people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. A continuation to a story I talked about yesterday, my previous video. It appears that Georgia OConnor will be returning to action next month on the 13th, but not on a Boxer show. In my previous video, I talked about how some of the fighters that started out with Boxer, they've been missing in action. Ebony Jones,
April Hunter. In this instance, Georgia OConnor.
young Georgia, who last saw action on the undercard of Shields versus Marshall in October of last year. 4 months well into this year, I didn't see any fight news by way of Boxer or Sky in reference to Georgia.
There's still some stories about Natasha Jonas, Savannah Marshall. We know they've scheduled fights for Lauren Price and Karis Ardingstall. They still got a few Valkyries over there.
Carolyn Dubois.
A few were missing. Georgia OConnor being one among them. Georgia OConnor, who sports a professional record of just 3 wins with no losses, no draws, no recorded knockouts, not yet.
She started out with Boxer. Upon Matchroom separating from Sky Sports and Boxer filling their shoes, taking their place, Georgia OConnor was among the first signees to Boxer.
She's a good fighter, very good fighter, campaigning at or around welter and between welter and junior middle.
Set to return to action on the 13th of next month. You figure that this possibly being Natasha Jonas's last year in the sport of boxing, that she may retire beyond this year, being in possession of 3 of the 4 alphabet titles at junior middle, you would think they would have used this year to position young Georgia OConnor to pick up one or some of those alphabet titles should they go vacant. But apparently, Georgia's next fight, it's not a Boxer show, and it doesn't look like she's with them anymore.
Same kind of deal as Ebony Jones.
Ebony Jones' next fight is taking place on the undercard of an Atlantic promotion. Georgia OConnor's next fight is taking place on the undercard of a Peacock promotion.
We're also going to see unbeaten D. Allen on that show.
It's another good, very good, hard-punching, unbeaten up-and-comer, unbeaten fighter.
So do you think that the reason that some of these fighters like Steven Robinson and Georgia OConnor, Ebony Jones...
Do you think the reason they're not with Boxer anymore, at least don't appear to be, is because Boxer is shedding the excess, trimming the fat, that initially they took on more fighters than they could hope to accommodate, and they're minimizing?
They could be. We saw something very similar with Matchroom 2-3 years ago when they first debuted in America, his own platform behind them. They had guys like Nkosi Solomon and Anthony Sims.
Michael Hunter. You will remember that Michael Hunter, he used to be a Matchroom fighter, and needless to say, these fighters, they parted ways with Matchroom. Are we seeing something similar? We seeing that going on here between these fighters and Boxer? Well, perhaps.
So what stands out about it is that Ebony Jones, Georgia OConnor, these are unbeaten fighters. Inexpensive ones at that.
It doesn't cost an arm and a leg to get opponents for these fighters. You ain't got to break the bank to pay them.
I don't want to jump to conclusions, but did Boxer cut them?
They might have, and I'm sure that the full details of Georgia OConnor and Ebony Jones's departure from Boxer will be made available shortly.
Because they're going to be returning to action shortly.
And who knows, maybe there are some nuances to their deal structure. We see that Raven Chapman, who's over there on the Queensbury Promotions side of things, she's got a deal structure to where she can fight on other shows besides Queensbury Promotions shows. She's still a Queensbury fighter.
So maybe this situation is similar to that one.
Might be. The virtue of staying in the Georgia OConnor business is that Georgia is a talented fighter and a very young fighter. She's only 23 years old. And if you stay in the Georgia OConnor business, you can position her to pick up the alphabet titles that Natasha Jonas might vacate when she retires, and that could be very soon.
If Boxer ain't got somebody up there to pick those titles up, you know what happens?
What?
Terry Harper swoops in, the only other champion at that weight, and she'll pick up those alphabet titles, giving Matchroom the run of the place.
Which, for me and you, isn't the worst thing in the world, but for Boxer, it might be. They have a vetted interest, a stake in the women's junior middleweight division.
At least they have so far.
That's the skinny. So long as Georgia OConnor stays active this year, fights 2, maybe 3 times, she's still on track.
She would be.
It is always better to have a promoter that has a major broadcast deal. Having that kind of money behind you, it is always better, but you work with what you've got.
And even if Boxer's not behind Georgia anymore, that don't mean she can't make the best out of the situation. She still can.
Lest we forget, Terry Harper, she didn't start out as a Matchroom fighter, She was fighting in small shows before Matchroom made the decision to sign her.
Initially, it was Steffi Bull that made the investment in Terry Harper, and it paid off.
Georgia's just got to keep grafting. Something will come around. Stay in the winner's bracket, continue to garner experience, and big things will happen. Look for Georgia O'Connor
next month on the 13th against an opponent that is yet to be announced.
Men's middleweight news, the latest on former unified champion Gennady Golovkin. Jaime Munguia trainer Eric Morales says Golovkin is leaving boxing for an indefinite period.
Not that long ago, Gennady Golovkin held 2 of the 4 major titles in the men's middleweight division, and now he's vacated both of them.
But he still hasn't officially retired. El Terrible informed the Spanish-language site Izquierdazo that he is told by a promotional company that is involved with Golovkin that the Kazakh boxer would be stepping away from the sport from an undetermined amount of time, or enough time where an attempt to try and pair him in the ring with Munguia would be a non-starter. Munguia, a former 154-pound titleist, has not fought since stopping overmatched Gonzalo Gaston Correa last year. He and his backers are under pressure to deliver a significant fight for this year. Co-promoter Oscar De La Coca insisted earlier in the year that his top goal in 2023 was to match Munguia with Golovkin.
Golovkin's 40, 41 years old? No alphabet titles for Jaime to win from this guy, and nobody views Gennady as the same fighter that he was years ago, years later.
He seems all but retired. He's coming off a largely perfunctory points loss to sworn rival Canelo Alvarez last September to complete their trilogy. I don't think we are looking for that fight, Morales told Izquierdazo. What I understand, what I was told by the promotional company, is that Golovkin told them that he is leaving boxing for an indefinite period of time, and that if he decides to come back, he will let everybody know. So we can't think about Golovkin right now, added Morales. We all would like it to be Golovkin, the entire team, especially Jaime.
Jaime can't wait around for this guy, and the matchmaking for Jaime has been terrible.
Golovkin is not there anymore.
Neither is Jermall Charlo in many ways. That division's WBC champion. He's been out of action for close to 2 years.
You've got Brazil's own Esquiva Falcao, who's the next man in line to pick up the newly vacated IBF title that Golovkin forfeited. And you have Erslan de Lara, the newly crowned WBA champion, as a result of non-compliance from Gennady to satisfy his mandatory challenger in Erslan. He didn't want to fight him, so he vacated that title as well. In a nutshell, the men's middleweight division is an open book with no big news, no new news.
Or good news coming out of it. I mean, what's the biggest story? What's the biggest fight going down at 160 pounds?
An overall lack of ambition and willingness to make big fights in the men's middleweight division is what has led to it being one of the most abysmal divisions in the sport today. Jaime Munguia has his role to play in that, but then again, so does Gennady,
who in many ways still is the biggest name at this weight. Though what's that saying about this weight, this division, that the biggest name is a 40, 41-year-old quasi-retired fighter?
Jermall Charlo's a quasi-retired fighter too. I mean, they say he's supposed to be coming back in June, but that's after a roughly 2-year stint of inactivity. For whatever reason, there's nothing good going on in the men's middleweight division, and the future is murky when it comes to Gennady Golovkin.
It's murky when it comes to Jaime too. What the hell is he supposed to do?
My honest opinion, once Esquiva Falcao finally procures the red belt, becomes this division's newly crowned IBF champion, Oscar should spend whatever he's got to spend and do whatever he's got to do to get that guy in the ring with Jaime.
Because Jaime Munguia needs a meaningful fight. He can't wait for Gennady.
When it comes to Gennady, Eddie Hearn very recently chimed in saying he lacks a bit of guidance. Not going to fight for just a couple of $1 million? Gennady Golovkin is no longer a champion at middleweight. It is not clear what Golovkin's next steps are. In a recent interview, Hearn seemed to suggest that Golovkin could have been given better advice as it related to his mandatory status with the sanctioning bodies. A bit of foresight, Hearn said, on the part of his handlers could have led to a situation where Golovkin could still call himself a titleist. Hearn has worked together with Golovkin in the past, and here today, at 41 years old with no alphabet titles.
You tell yourself that Golovkin, at this age, he's not going to fight on the cheap, though at the same time, he forfeited his 2 alphabet titles.
I don't know, time constraints, whatever it was. Maybe he couldn't have kept both alphabet titles, but it would have behooved him to hang on to one, at least one, because that still gives him some leverage and some value in a situation that if down the line you do a fight with a Jaime Munguia, it's worth something. There's a title on the line. You can still do that fight now.
You can do it for no belts at all, but it won't have the same luster.
Golovkin not having those belts, it just makes it that much more obvious that he's close to retiring.
Which would, in effect, take away from the overall attractiveness of a fight.
I think I'm probably going to upset someone now. I just feel recently, particularly now. I just think he lacks a little bit of guidance, Hearn said of Golovkin's in an interview on the Boxing with Chris Mannix podcast. Do you know what I mean? He's very experienced. He's got a great team of people around him, but sometimes you need someone steering the ship. By steering the ship, I mean standing right in front, looking out for the weather, and telling you exactly where you are going. I feel like he got into a situation, and it's not really his fault because the Lara fight was called on him. The Falcao fight was called on him, which is probably the fight that I would have taken. Also, Golovkin has gotten to a stage where he doesn't actually need the belts, but it would be quite nice to have one.
You could sell Munguia versus Golovkin for no belts at all, and it would still draw. It would still do good business, though it would do even better business if Golovkin were still a champion and it were an opportunity for Jaime to become a 2-division champion as it stands. If you did that fight now,
like I said, it just makes it that much more obvious that Gennady's not the same fighter that he used to be. He's not a champion anymore. He's in the twilight years of his career, and that takes away from the attractiveness of a fight.
so I guess the silver lining is that there isn't one. There is no fight. Gennady Golovkin's gonna be out for an indeterminate amount of time.
Got no alphabet titles. He's got none. That's the problem with no one steering the ship, not looking out for mandatories. You can have people working on the ship, but you need to be seeing what is ahead. Just to let you know, it's the anticipation. You have to be 5 or 6 steps ahead. So when you go into that Canelo fight, you're already speaking to the governing bodies and making sure you have a plan in place if you lose. But he lost, then the mandatories are called on him, then he relinquished them.
Relinquish the IBF, relinquish the WBA.
And then before you know it, he's no longer a world champion. And that kind of speeds up the process of retirement because you sort of get to a stage where actually, oh, I got rid of the belts.
40-year-old fighter like Gennady's not going to run through a gauntlet to get them back.
Too many miles on the odometer, making it that much more obvious that he's close to retiring.
Golovkin last boxed in September.
We're coming up not far from May, Hearn said. He hasn't got a fight scheduled. You don't really want to be fighting once a year at 41. I love the Jaime Munguia fight because I think Gennady was the favorite in that fight. And it's a great fight for Jaime. The problem is as well, just being honest, Gennady Golovkin is accustomed to making a lot of money. And he's not going to come back and fight for a couple $1 million. So you've got to put your hand in your pockets to get Gennady Golovkin back in the ring. And with no world titles,
Coming off a loss, 41 years old, who's down to do that? Who's going to break the bank for today's Gennady Golovkin?
who's going to want to? For Gennady at this age, of course, to get you out of bed, it's going to take a lot of money. But at this age, what are you worth to the promoters?
It's looking more and more like he should just hang them up.
And he might. It wouldn't surprise me.
You know, obviously, there's no issue later that he could say, yeah, we wanted the fight, but like Bivol didn't want to accept it or didn't want to accept the terms. Because there's certain things. I mean, Bivol already beat him. He's not as motivated, and it's not really that big of a challenge for him. So they have to meet certain terms that we're asking for. And one of those terms right now is, Bivol wants to fight him at 168. First of all, it's enticing for him to put all the titles on the line, and he doesn't want any more excuses. Bivol wants it to be a fight where there's no more excuses. Right. Because Canelo said after the last fight that, he went up in weight. But he's done that before. And, Manny Pacquiao has done that. De La Hoya has done that. A lot of fighters have done it. And saying that, I made a mistake the time that you lose, it doesn't really, it doesn't sound right because it wasn't a mistake when you won, when you beat Kovalev. So why is it now that it's not your weight class?
Canelo has previously stated that he wants the rematch with Dimitri to happen at light heavyweight for Dimitri's belt, whereas Dimitri seems to want Canelo's belts. They may be at an impasse if they don't reach agreeable terms. According to Eddie Hearn, Canelo is hell-bent on getting Dimitri back in the ring. So is he willing to concede?
If you've been seeing Dimitri Bivol's interviews in the subsequent months that followed his shock upset win over Canelo Alvarez, he's always seemed very blasé about fighting him for a second time. time. He went as far as telling Steve Kim that he wants to get his own belts at light heavyweight.
He wants belts more than he wants a Canelo Alvarez fight, a Canelo rematch, because he already beat him.
If he fights him again at light heavyweight, it'll just be a voluntary title defense.
Initially, most people didn't realize that all this talk of the rematch happening at super middleweight, it wasn't at Canelo Alvarez's request. It was at Dimitri's, because he wants Canelo's belts in the super middleweight division, that if he's got to run it back with this guy, it better be for more than it was the last time, hence explaining this recent development, which isn't so recent at all.
Just spin the story.
Most interpreted all this talk of the rematch happening at super middleweight instead of light heavyweight as a veiled attempt to weaken Dimitri Bivol, to drain him, when it's not Canelo asking for this, it's Dimitri.
And if you've been following the career of Dimitri Bivol over the years, on many occasions he said that he can still make super middleweight, that he's not a big light heavyweight, and he'd be willing to come down for guys like Callum Smith.
Callum Smith years ago, years later, he's willing to come down for Canelo so long as Canelo makes it for all the marbles. That would remove all the quote-unquote excuses, which really don't seem like excuses to me.
They're relevant factors. It's a relevant factor that Canelo isn't a legitimate light heavyweight.
He isn't now, and he never was.
But if that in any way seems like a crutch for Canelo Alvarez to lean on, Dimitri Bivol means to kick it from under him. He's willing to fight him at super middleweight, a better weight for Canelo than light heavyweight, surely.
Canelo's had the corrective surgery to his injured hand, taking care of that nagging injury that perhaps hampered him in the first Bivol fight. It shouldn't be an issue in the second, not now.
Dimitri Bivol, he's got a pesky style, a style that don't do Canelo any favors.
168, 175, this guy's base style, his execution is gonna give Canelo problems.
The only hope is that he won't be as durable as a super middleweight as he has been as a light heavyweight, because I told you ahead of the fight, Canelo don't stop this guy. He don't put a dent in it.
The most he can hope to do is throw punches and bunches and outwork the guy, or at least appear to. Try to win the rounds that way, because you're not knocking this guy out.
You figure if Dimitri don't come back over the summer months, if he sits out most of this year and don't come back till September, he boils down to super middle as opposed to light heavy.
In some small way, that might better Canelo's chances, though that's on the premise that Canelo is willing to engage Dimitri for his belts instead of Dimitri's.
We don't know that he is. They may be at an impasse.
And if this thing between them falls apart, that does leave the door open for Dimitri to then move on and face the winner of Better Beef versus Smith, which may go down in the summer months.
I mean, if Callum Smith wins...
Not saying that he will, so much as if he does, well, that makes things very easy for Dimitri Bivol now, doesn't it?
The next fight for him would be a no-brainer.
In that scenario, it would be if things fall apart with Canelo, but Callum pulls the upset.
You could do that fight in Liverpool.
But we are still getting ahead of ourselves. Many details in association with all of this are still quite immaterial.
We don't know what's going to happen.
Is this going to be a problem? Is this, the weight of the match, going to be a sticking point?
For Dimitri, for Canelo.